What you saw in Red Square on May 9th was not a military parade. It was a funeral. The funeral of the security order you have lived under your entire life, and almost nobody on television will say it plainly. Hold that image in your head for a second. North Korean troops, soldiers from the most isolated, most sanctioned, most condemned regime on the planet, marching in formation through the most symbolic square of the most contested war in Europe, carrying their flag, saluted by the Russian president, filmed by the world's cameras, broadcast by TASS to a global audience. That did not happen. Until this week, not once in 81 years of Victory Day parades. Not during the Cold War, not during the Korean War, when the Soviets were actively arming Pyongyang in secret. Never. And then this week it did. And the reason it happened, the real reason, the reason behind the reason, has almost nothing to do with North Korea. It has everything to do with you, if you live in any country that ever relied on a piece of paper signed in Washington. Because what those soldiers were marching to announce without saying a single word is that the American century now has a date stamp on it. And the date is closer than you think. I will show you exactly how close in the next few minutes. There are three specific things happening simultaneously right now that most analysts will not connect for you. They will report them as separate stories. A parade here, a weapons transfer there, a summit somewhere else, disconnected fragments, background noise. They are not separate. They are one architecture being built in plain sight, and the framework for understanding it has a name. Strategic planners call it patronage substitution, the precise moment when a state under sanctions discovers it does not need the global system anymore because it has quietly built a parallel one. The anchor number is this: $600 million. According to Nikkei Asia's reporting from late 2025, that is what Moscow paid Pyongyang for troops and ammunition in just over 12 months. $600 million. To put that in human terms, that figure is roughly equal to North Korea's entire annual export earnings before the war in Ukraine began. In 1 year, Russia handed Kim Jong-un a second economy. That is what the parade was actually celebrating. Not the defeat of Nazi Germany 81 years ago. The birth of a financial, military, and diplomatic system that operates entirely outside Washington's reach. And by the end of this analysis, you will understand the geometry of this new order more clearly than 99% of the commentary you will read this week. But first, you need the foundation, and the foundation begins with a question almost nobody is asking. Why does any state agree to be a smaller power in someone else's order? That is the question. Because the post-1945 American alliance system rests on a single proposition. Small and medium states accept dependence on the United States in exchange for security guarantees no rival power can match. South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Germany, Poland, the Gulf monarchies, every single one of them made the same bet. Stay inside the system. Accept American troops on your soil, American currency in your central bank, American technology controls on your industries. In return, the United States stands between you and your worst-case scenario. That bet held for 80 years. It held through Vietnam. It held through the Iranian Revolution. It held through 2008. It is not holding anymore, and the parade told you why. In June 2024, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un signed what they called a comprehensive strategic partnership. The document includes a mutual defense clause, language that, in diplomatic terms, is functionally identical to what Article 5 of NATO does for European states. An attack on one is an attack on both. Read that twice. A nuclear-armed power outside the Western system has just given a binding security guarantee to a pariah state. The architecture has changed. Henry Kissinger warned in his final years that the moment a sanctioned regime acquires a great power security guarantee, the alliance system of the previous era begins to dissolve from the inside. That is not flowery prose. That is the precise mechanism, and it is exactly what just happened. But here is what makes this week's parade different from the signing in 2024. In the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through three specific countries, none of them obvious, two of them American allies, that are quietly reading this parade exactly the way Pyongyang intended it to be read. One of them is already drafting the legal language for its own independent nuclear deterrent. Another just approved the largest single military expansion in its entire post-war history. The third is the one almost nobody is naming yet. And once you see what they are preparing to do, the next decade looks completely different. The signing in 2024 was a contract. The parade this month was a ceremony. And ceremonies matter in international relations more than contracts do, because contracts can be denied and ceremonies cannot. When North Korean soldiers carry their flag across Red Square, when the North Korean ambassador stands in the reviewing stand and applauds them when the Kremlin films it and TASS broadcasts it to the planet, that is not a press release. That is what political scientists call a costly signal. Russia is telling every country watching, this relationship is permanent, it is public, and it survives the war in Ukraine. Whatever happens next month, next year, next decade, this bond does not unwind. Now think about who exactly is watching. The first country is South Korea. The South Korean Unification Ministry, on May 11th of this year, confirmed publicly that what Pyongyang demonstrated by marching in Moscow was, in the ministry's own careful diplomatic language, the depth of its military ties with Russia. That phrase sounds bureaucratic. The translated meaning is much harsher. Seoul is now living with the documented fact that its northern neighbor, a regime whose missiles can reach every South Korean city in under 7 minutes, has a permanent great power backer with nuclear weapons and a UN Security Council veto. That changes the entire mathematics of deterrence, because the implicit deal that kept the Korean peninsula stable since 1953 was this: South Korea would not pursue its own nuclear weapons because the United States would provide what is called extended deterrence. The promise that an attack on Seoul would be treated as an attack on Washington. That promise was credible only as long as North Korea stood alone, isolated without a patron. Pyongyang, with Russia standing behind it, is a completely different mathematical problem. And South Korean defense intellectuals, people who have been politely silent on this subject for 30 years, are now writing openly that Seoul may need its own bomb. The second country is Japan. Tokyo's position is even more precarious. Japan sits geographically between two nuclear-armed states that are now actively coordinating: Russia to the north, North Korea directly across the sea, and a third, China, whose naval buildup in the East China Sea is accelerating every quarter. The Council on Foreign Relations published an assessment arguing that a future conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan would be qualitatively more dangerous for Japan if North Korea and Russia opportunistically opened a second front in the north. That was the warning. The parade is the confirmation. The coordination is no longer theoretical. It is on film. This is where the numbers stop being abstract and start arriving at Japanese front doors. Japan now spends more on defense than at any point since the Second World War, roughly $59 billion in fiscal year 2026, according to the Japanese Ministry of Defense. That figure has nearly doubled in 4 years, and every yen of it is being justified inside Japanese policy circles with the same quiet phrase: "We may not have time." The third country is the one almost nobody outside specialist circles is naming yet: Taiwan. Taiwan is reading this parade differently than Seoul or Tokyo, and the difference is everything. Because Taiwan's deterrent has never been a treaty. There is no NATO for Taiwan, no signed mutual defense obligation, no binding promise. Taiwan's deterrent has always been a perception, the perception that Washington would arrive if Beijing moved. The parade in Moscow attacks that perception at its foundation. Not because Russia and North Korea are directly involved in the Taiwan question, but because the parade demonstrates something the Chinese Communist Party will study with extreme care. Pyongyang did everything American policy planners had said would destroy it. It supplied weapons to a major war against a US-aligned country. It deployed troops, South Korean intelligence estimated up to 15,000 by early 2026, to fight on Russian battle lines. It openly defied nuclear-related sanctions. And not only did it survive, it got paid, it got legitimacy, it got to march in Red Square. For the strategic planners in Beijing, that documented case study is worth more than any internal white paper. It is the empirical proof that the cost of defying Washington is no longer catastrophic. It is, in their calculation, profitable. Here is where the three threads, Seoul's nuclear question, Tokyo's quiet rearmament, and Beijing's cold recalculation, all converge. And the place where they converge is not in Asia at all. It is in a conversation happening in 3 European capitals that almost nobody in the Western press is covering yet. Step outside the Pacific for a moment, because this parade in Red Square was watched with unusual intensity in 3 European capitals that the headlines have mostly skipped: Warsaw, Berlin, and Paris. Poland watched the parade because Poland sits on the front line of any war that comes next. Polish defense spending reached 4.7% of GDP in 2025, according to Poland's Ministry of National Defense, the highest of any NATO member, higher than the United States itself. That is not a normal allocation. That is a state preparing for a contingency it now considers genuinely plausible. The Polish calculation is direct. If Russia can absorb roughly 6,000 North Korean casualties, the figure South Korean intelligence reported earlier this year, and continue fighting without flinching, then the Russian military is regenerating manpower at a scale no European army can match alone. Poland is preparing for a war it now suspects Washington may not show up to in time. Germany watched the parade for a different reason entirely. The German political class spent 2 years arguing about whether the post-war prohibition on serious military spending could hold. As of 2026, that argument is over. Germany approved a special defense fund worth roughly $109 billion, the largest single military allocation in German history since 1945. And the political consensus underneath it has shifted in a way that older Germans find genuinely disorienting. The parade in Moscow is now used inside German strategic documents as Exhibit A for why the consensus had to change. The unthinkable became thinkable because the alternative, depending on a wavering American security guarantee, became more unthinkable still. And France watched the parade with the cold satisfaction of a country that has been arguing for 60 years that Europe needs strategic autonomy from the United States. President Macron's 2024 Sorbonne speech, where he warned that Europe could die, is now being read in every European foreign ministry as prophetic rather than alarmist. Before we go any further, something here deserves a full stop. We are talking about parades and budgets and acronyms, but underneath every figure are real human costs that should not get lost in the abstractions. South Korean intelligence assesses that approximately 6,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed or wounded in Ukraine since the deployment began. Those are 6,000 young men, most of them under 25, sent from one of the poorest countries on earth to die in trenches in a war their own families will never have explained to them honestly. The Russian and Ukrainian casualties are larger by orders of magnitude. Documented figures cross hundreds of thousands on both sides combined, according to Western and Ukrainian estimates as of early 2026. Those numbers are not statistics. They sit behind every strategic calculation in this analysis, and they should. Now return to the structural question. What the parade announced, not in words but in choreography, is that the costs of being a pariah state with a great power patron are now manageable, and the costs of being an unprotected ally are now rising sharply. The probability that South Korea pursues independent nuclear weapons within the next decade, a question that even in 2020 was considered nearly unthinkable inside Seoul's establishment, is now estimated by serious Korean and American analysts at somewhere between 25 and 40%. That is not a fringe view anymore. The Asan Institute, the most respected security policy research center in Korea, published polling showing more than 70% of South Koreans favor an independent nuclear deterrent. Polling is not policy, but polling is what policy follows. Every student of military history knows that alliance systems do not collapse all at once. They unravel at the edges first. The smallest, most exposed members defect quietly to hedge their bets. Then the medium-sized members start hedging too. Then the core notices, and by the time the core notices, the geometry has already changed underneath them. That is how the concert of Europe ended. That is how the British imperial preference system ended. The endings converge in ways that are uncomfortable to contemplate, because they all begin with a single, public, choreographed signal that the old order can now be defied without serious consequence. The parade in Red Square on May 9th was that signal. Step back from the parade itself for a moment, because here is what all of this, the partnership, the troops, the marching, the silence of Western capitals, actually means for everyone watching this who is not in Washington, Moscow, or Pyongyang. And it is far more practical than it sounds. What I want you to take from this is not fear. Fear is not useful. Panic is not useful. What is useful is clarity, the map. Because when you understand precisely what game is being played, you can see what is coming before it arrives in the headlines. Now I want to give the counter-argument a fair hearing because serious people with serious credentials look at exactly what I have described and land somewhere much calmer. They will tell you the North Korea-Russia partnership is transactional, not structural, that Putin needs warm bodies and ammunition for an unwinnable war, and that once the Ukraine conflict ends, by negotiation or exhaustion or whatever path, the partnership shrinks back to something manageable. They will point out that China is genuinely uncomfortable with the closeness between Moscow and Pyongyang, that Beijing has never liked being upstaged by a small client, and that this discomfort places a natural ceiling on how far the partnership can grow. They will remind you that the United States, even under strain, remains the only state on Earth with a globally deployable Navy and a network of more than 750 overseas military installations. None of that is wrong. The honest picture, stripped of both the panic and the complacency, is this. The American alliance system is not collapsing. It is being repriced. The implicit deal, security in exchange for dependence, is now being renegotiated quietly in every capital that depends on it. Some of those renegotiations will end with deeper integration into the American order, with bigger defense purchases and tighter coordination. Some will end with quiet hedging, a few diplomatic exchanges with Beijing here, a few oil deals with Moscow there. A small number will end with countries reaching for capabilities, nuclear, industrial, diplomatic, that they would never have considered when the old deal felt reliable. So if you want to know which direction this resolves before any headline announces it, watch 3 specific things. Watch whether South Korea's next defense white paper contains language about an independent deterrent capability. That document is published every 2 years, and the next edition is the one to read carefully. Watch whether Japan formally amends its 3 non-nuclear principles, or begins permitting U.S. nuclear-armed vessels in Japanese ports without the diplomatic fiction of denial. and watch whether any European NATO member begins discussing, even informally, even at the margins of academic conferences, the idea of a European nuclear umbrella independent of the American one. Those three signals taken together will tell you whether the parade in Red Square was a one-time photograph or the founding image of a new century. The signals are already starting to appear in academic journals, in policy speeches the mainstream press does not cover, in defense budget line items that move quietly between categories. The people paid to watch these things are watching. The question is whether you are watching with them. The deepest lesson in all of this is not about North Korea or Russia or even about Washington. It is about how alliances actually function. Alliances are not promises. They are perceptions. They hold for exactly as long as the perception holds, and they collapse the moment the perception breaks. A column of North Korean troops marching unmolested across Red Square, filmed and celebrated and saluted, did not break any treaty. It broke a perception, and once a perception breaks, it cannot be unbroken by speeches or reassurances. It can only be replaced by a new perception, built by someone with the imagination to construct it. History gives us the map, and the map says we have been here before.